I actually had a listener reach out to me, which you are all at any time free to do. I would love to hear your feedback on the show. He reached out and he said he wanted to hear more about my story. He said, clearly you've been able to glean insight and gain wisdom from many different sources. How did you do this? Why did you do this? How can we, the listener, do it too? I mean, he makes a good point. I have perhaps left out some important parts of my story, and they will get filled in as we go along here. But I think that this, in fact, is a great jumping off point to sort of reinforce one of the primary topics of the show. Not even a topic so much as the ethos, right? The undergirding principle, the reason and the how I do this show. And it is quite simply this: you, the listener, you, the individual, me, the individual. We are the source of our own learning. I would even be so bold as to say that I would want this podcast to be a companion for you for a year or a few months, and then you move on. Of course, feel free to stay subscribed and check in every so often on your old pal. I'll still be here. But I think that, and especially in this digital age, our human curiosity and our need to be led, our need to be authoritatively told how to behave, what to think, leads us to look to outside sources such as podcasts, gurus on Twitter, courses, the news, the newspaper, your neighbor down the street. And I wouldn't say that you shouldn't do that. I can't tell you how to live. I have tried to really limit how much I go searching for, especially when it comes to personal development and mental health. I am the source of my understanding of these subjects. And again, I realize the irony here as a podcaster talking about self-development, hoping that people will come to me for information, for perspective. But again, I think that take what you can from this and move on. There have been a few gurus or personalities over the years that I've enjoyed their content, Jordan Peterson being one. But I don't listen to him very often anymore. I took what I could from him and I feel I've outgrown him. That doesn't mean his message isn't valid. That doesn't mean that he's not still growing and putting great wisdom out for those who wish to consume it. I could not make another man's voice such a force in my life. I had to become more and more the single point of how I thought about what I wanted to do in life. And so I must say the biggest leaps and bounds that I have made in my life, breaking my dependency on marijuana, reducing nearly to zero my use of pornography, no longer feeling the need to look at images on the screen to gratify myself, improving myself in social situations, healing my relationship to food to the point now where I'm getting real close to the six-pack abs and the veins in the biceps. All of these great gains, these strides, these points of pride, these avenues in which I've developed and understood myself, I really didn't take a ton of advice from the outside world. So how did I do it then? Mindfulness, truly. I sought first to observe myself. What was I up to? What was I doing? What was I thinking? Why or how did I feel when I engaged in these activities that I knew did not help me? And when I was deep in those addictions, eating mindlessly, using marijuana regularly, using pornography to self-soothe, I was not mindful. I was not aware of the feelings I had. I was not aware of the reasons for doing these things. And over time, I became able to understand, as I became more mindful, more self-aware, that so much of these behaviors were pain-killing behaviors. All three of those that I mentioned. I used those as drugs and distractions. I was ultimately distracting or ignoring underlying issues. I was afraid to be myself. So at the risk of constantly now repeating myself for the remainder of doing this podcast, if you are the source of your own learning, if you need to develop solutions for yourself, you're still going to be asking, well, what the hell? How do I start? How can I at least start? It's those three tenets of mindfulness. Am I focused on the present? Am I thinking and acting in unison? Am I practicing self-control? So when we're talking about an addiction, say, quite often, we're not thinking about the present. We're thinking about getting that next fix, right? And so I'm not saying that changes overnight, but through mindfulness and through, as we'll talk about, reflection, we begin to see these are the moments when my mind strays away from the present and begins to think about getting that next fix. What are the things in the present that trigger me to need that soothing, to need that distraction, to need that painkiller? Now that pairs quite nicely with thinking and acting in unison. Am I driving down the road thinking about driving down the road? Or am I driving down the road thinking about the next cigarette, getting home to use pornography, the next joint, the next hookup, the next whatever it is you use to feel better? And again, through reflection, as we'll see, we begin to understand where our mind goes. And I'm a big believer in specifically what you are addicted to reveals exactly the nature of the issue that you are distracting yourself from and soothing. And so quite easily we can see then, am I practicing self-control? Likely not. Likely I've allowed my mind to stray. I've refused to address the underlying issues, and now I'm driving hard because of my addiction towards that next hit, that next fix. And self-control's gone out the window. Breathing, posture, what I'm saying and doing in some cases. So when the question comes, how did I find all this out? How have I gone on to overcome certain addictions? And some I'm still working on, by the way. We'll get to that in the near future as well. I have become the source of that. And I don't mean to sound overly prideful. I don't mean to sound like I'm special in some way. But if you yourself are seeking help, or you are seeking advice, or you are seeking solutions, that's all well and good. There's plenty of good information out there. There's plenty of useful information out there. But balance it is what I would say with that mindfulness. Inform yourself on mindfulness, because you becoming aware of yourself leads to you finding the solutions to the problems you have for yourself. And I can tell you, it's all the sweeter when those solutions actually work. And they won't all work, but it's all the sweeter when they do. Quite simply, I'll remind you, the 3 tenets of mindfulness, at least for me, and there could be more for you, those are your first steps to freedom.